It's already started. Okay, great. Why don't we begin? Welcome back to the Tower Center for today's seminar and our continuing series on Trump and. We've looked at Trump and a number of different issues, and today we're going to be looking at President Trump and the future of counterterrorism. We're very pleased today to be joined by Dr. Erin Simpson, who is the CEO of Archer Avenue Consultancy in Washington, D.C. She has a long and varied background. She's a Harvard PhD, went on to teach Marines for a while, about 10 years ago. Then decided to go to Afghanistan, where she was an advisor to U.S. forces. General Petraeus, who else did you work for? General McChrystal, and has come back and has worked in various positions in Washington ever since, with a focus on counterinsurgency, national security policy, and big data, which she's been doing some really extraordinary work on. I should also mention one other thing about Dr. Simpson. She is one of the participants in a regular podcast called Bombshell. It's Dr. Simpson and her colleagues Lauren Schulman and
Rod Iyengar,
who discuss national security issues. And it's really fun, it's informative. So Google it. It's called Bombshell. It's a fun 45 minutes. It'll help you on your drive. Today the topic is counterterrorism. Our speaker will go for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Erin Simpson to this council.
Okay, I'm going to stand behind the podium because I've got some notes on my computer thingamajig up here. So thanks, Josh, and to the Tower Center for having me down. Most of what I know about SMU is that you too have had Larry Brown as a basketball coach, and he too left. So that's, I could say that's an exclusive club, but it's actually quite a long list. I'm a University of Kansas undergrad originally, so that's my piece on that, and that's all we're going to say about college basketball for the day. So. As Josh said, my background is kind of in the counterinsurgency space, and I've done a lot of work on data and kind of defense innovation over the last several years. I've had some help putting notes together on counterterrorism for you all. So I'm trying to keep this conversation at kind of the big picture level. If you guys have specific questions, we'll dive into those as best we can. And if there are folks in the room who have answers to those questions, you are encouraged to speak up as well. So. I don't have a ton of slides. This is not like a death by PowerPoint briefing at the Pentagon or anything. I want to talk generally about some of the elements of a counterterrorism strategy, or a counterterrorism campaign. Strategy may be a strong word here. Current activities, some policies under consideration, and then what wonks are wondering. Kind of what are some of the outstanding questions about the path forward that we don't have good answers to yet. So when we think about counterterrorism strategies or counterterrorism campaigns, I think usually the first thing that comes to mind are the military elements, right? So we can think about what we're doing with regards to ground raids, airstrikes, whether from drones or manned aircraft, a little bit longer term training and equipping missions, such as we've done in Iraq, and advise and assist, which is a little bit more advanced than just providing training, but we're actually working, if not directly on the front lines, 5 feet back from them, working with troops that are actually in combat. We can talk about all of those in various incarnations. We've seen those things employed in a variety of theaters over the last 16 years now, and certainly can see each of those elements in play across Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, assorted places. Of course, what enables those military raids or other efforts to be effective, such as they are, is the underlying intelligence work. And we could do a whole lecture that was just about, we're actually going to talk about intelligence this afternoon in Josh's class. But there are any number of investments and capabilities that we have on the intelligence side that really drive counterterrorism activities. And, here we can think about, these are, at the most generic level, signals intelligence or SIGINT, overhead imagery, it's called IMINT, human sources, HUMINT. And of course, putting all these pieces together is what drives both the timeliness, right? So counterterrorism is not just about knowing where people are, but when they're going to be there. And also who matters in a particular network or a system, so the analytical functions that underlie that. certainly one of the biggest breakthroughs, I would say, over the last 15 years is what folks sometimes call ops intel fusion, really getting the operators and the intelligence analysts and collectors working hand in hand so that this cycle can move quite fast. That's really what General McChrystal did in Iraq with Mike Flynn in 2006, 2007, and is part of kind of the elite special operations capability that we continue to have through the Joint Special Operations Command. So that's the part that we tend to think the most about, I think. When people talk about counterterrorism, at least certainly in the Washington discussions, we're mostly talking about this military and intelligence cycle to things. There's also a significant amount of, certainly not as much in terms of money, but in terms of attention, on countering violent extremism. That tends to be housed within the development and diplomatic agencies, so the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development. The Brits do similar things through their aid organizations at DFID. We can think about counter-radicalization, development assistance, institution building. Those are all geared towards addressing some of the grievances that might drive individuals to join terrorist groups, that might create some of the ungoverned spaces that allow terrorist groups to emerge. This is somewhat controversial. I'm not a huge fan of some of the underlying theories that go into our CVE programming, but it's certainly part of the you can't kill them all. We actually need to address some underlying, whether you want to use the language of root causes, that is a long-term portion of our strategy over the years. The last piece there is influence operations, which is mostly housed with the military, although there's some public diplomacy and strategic communications that the State Department engages in as well. And that's trying to much more specifically either discredit malign actors in countries of interest, promote what we think are stabilizing or useful actors in countries of interest, and otherwise persuade individuals to toward more secular organizations, toward less violent organizations, to keep, in particular, young men out of the reach of Salafi jihadi organizations. And that's done in a variety of places around the world. Those programs are run by what are called MISO teams, or at least what were called for a while MISO teams. It's a horrible name. The military has lots of horrible names. They don't have anything to do with soup, as far as I can tell, but military influence support operations. You might think of them as PSYOPs, actually not psychological operations. It's related, but a distinct set of activities. And those tend to be run out of the embassies, typically, although there's a lot of work that gets done in Tampa on that front as well. So we've got military intelligence, and then a little bit of softer side. Threat finance is actually a pretty significant part of long-term and wide-ranging counterterrorism efforts. We can think about that in terms of freezing bank accounts, tracking organizations through the money. This is the Follow the Money campaign. It has its own acronym, which doesn't get to be a word. It's just FTM. And identifying individuals who are providing what is referred to in the law enforcement community as material support, right? And so this both has international elements, but the FBI also cooperates quite a lot. It looks at a lot of threat finance issues. And so a lot of folks that get brought up in these investigations domestically are less likely to be actively planning things, but maybe have sent money to Al-Shabaab, right? Or have sent money to charities that are or are not fronts for extremist organizations elsewhere in the world. And so that can be somewhat complicated. We can talk about that with regard to Muslim Brotherhood here in a little bit. But the threat finance piece is actually pretty important because the way that large groups raise money and move money is a significant part of how they're actually able to conduct operations. It's really hard to move people around the world and buy things and support people for complex operations if you can't move money. Last piece, and this is not usually something we would find in many CT conversations, but it is part of, I think, very much the way the Trump administration views its counterterrorism agenda, which is a focus on immigration and border controls. Certainly, we might think about kind of DHS and airport security on kind of the front line of that. I would give my kingdom to bring full-size shampoo and moisturizer on an airplane again. you guys are fine. You just take whatever they have in the hotel, but this requires product and effort, and it doesn't always come in a 3-ounce bottle. So, but we have other elements of this that are sometimes well integrated, sometimes not. Of course, there's been a lot of discussion on the refugee ban, on the list of the visa restrictions that have come out by executive order in the last couple of months, and other watch lists where we have sort of names of individuals who are on do not fly lists and other kinds of things. Again, this is, I think, elevated in the last few months within the Trump administration as to being not more important, but a more public focus, whereas previous administrations might have tried to downplay the existence of those watch lists for fear of offending allies or accused of profiling. That is exactly the foot that this administration seems to want to put forward. They're quite proud of that. So there has been a lot of work done, this again kind of with a data hat on, of trying to merge the different intelligence and law enforcement agencies' lists of people of concern. So one of the reasons why the refugee vetting takes so long is that you're actually, like, the piece of paper moves to the desks of each different agency as they check their systems. So it would, of course, be nice to have kind of one-stop shopping on those systems, but that integration hasn't really made some progress, but not a great deal on that. So this is there are other things that we do for counterterrorism. You could make an argument that every military activity we do in the Middle East has some counterterrorism impact. Diplomacy day to day in any number of capitals, around the world plays into our counterterrorism strategy, to include our diplomacy in Europe, both in terms of the counter-ISIL coalition, but also working with intelligence sharing with European partners who have a different sort of exposure to a terrorism threat than we seem to at the moment. But what I wanted to just emphasize here is that we actually do lots of things that aren't just raids and airstrikes, right? There's a lot of elements that go into that. We can pull levers in any number of those places. And as I mentioned, we actually have quite an array of locations where we're conducting operations. And again, this list could be 100 countries long if you want every place that somebody from Special Operations Command has shown up in the last couple of years. But these are the places: Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. I'd like to remind people that we still have 10,000 troops in Afghanistan. Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Niger, and Mali. There's some number of boots on the ground, but it's not exactly clear what level of engagement they're up to. We used to have a thing called the Trans-Sahel Initiative, which was pretty important in terms of dealing with AQIM, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic Maghreb, but is like a really difficult place to operate and work. I mean, it's just like south of the Sahara, so it's a vast amount of ungoverned space across several countries with very little governance or military capacity. Not the most fun thing. So this is, broadly speaking, kind of what we can get up to from the counterterrorism perspective. We've seen we're in kind of day 65-ish, of the Trump administration, and we've seen a few different activities that give us some window into their thinking. So I'm going to try to speak mostly from what we've observed so far, and then I'll give you a little bit of Washington chatter. Of course, we had a raid in Yemen at the end of January. This is not a picture of the raid itself, but it's something cool blowing up in Sana'a. The raid did not go well. We lost a U.S. service member, a Navy SEAL was killed in that. A number of Yemeni civilians, we believe, were also killed. Unclear if there was useful intelligence recovered from that or not. And of course, these things happen, right? I mean, we have raids can go bad in any number of circumstances. What's interesting here is this is the first ground raid that had been authorized in Yemen in quite some time. We know it was pitched to the Obama administration, and they basically said, well, the timing isn't right in terms of moonlight and some other stuff, and so we also don't want to have a major shift in policy like in our last week in office, so we're going to leave this to you guys. And they went ahead with that. So we'll come back to Yemen, because there's a kind of a big question mark over exactly what we're doing in Yemen. But the Yemen raid is certainly goes back to an older style of activity that the Obama administration had essentially abandoned which is to do actual ground raids with U.S. forces, as opposed to working with partnered forces. Next up, we've got folks from the 82nd Airborne in Iraq, outside of Mosul. They're providing artillery and other fire support. Similarly, we've got Marines in Syria. Those are folks from the 11th MU, and they are just north of Raqqa. Variety of combat enablers, including some logistics folks, but also mostly artillery in that space. Again, not at the front lines, but most of this artillery can't be that far from it. There's some HIMARS batteries and other things kind of lurking around there. We also had, it's hard to describe how incredible these pictures are. This is folks from Ranger Battalion in northern Syria as well, driving in Strikers, very prominently flying American flags, which tend not to be how our special operations forces usually comport themselves when in foreign countries that they aren't there by invitation. But the Rangers who came into Syria are essentially there to keep two of our allies from shooting at each other, which would be the Turks and the Syrian Kurds, who have actually fought each other over pieces of terrain in northern Syria along the Turkish border in the last several months. So that's 3 separate, I would say, small military deployments. There's about 400 Marines in Syria. There was just a request for another few hundred folks from the 82nd to go to Mosul, in addition to the folks who are already there, which brings the troop numbers in Iraq probably to, 3,500 or so. And then this Rangers deployment as well. That's much of that was kind of in the process over the months. You don't just send a few hundred folks to foreign countries overnight, even in the United States military, but is clearly part of acceleration of the strategy. I'm not sure that I would say escalation just yet, but an acceleration of the strategy in Syria. We'll come back and talk about Syria here again in a second. So we have a ground raid in Yemen, increases in troops, and potentially an expansion of the mission sets in Syria and Iraq. And then, of course, we have the current activities of the travel and visa restrictions. This was just my favorite of the protest signs from the executive order protests. And Royal Jordanian Airlines has been doing some world-class trolling of this laptop ban, which nobody's been able to really quite figure out, but 12 things to do on a 12-hour flight with no laptop or tablet. The last of which, number 11 is analyze the meaning of life, and the last of which is think of reasons why you don't have a laptop or a tablet with you. So there's a lot of parsing that goes into people trying to figure out what is the threat and what kind of threat would be addressed with these sets of policies. The Brits came out a couple days later with a similar set of restrictions, but from a slightly different set of countries, which is partially a function of where there are direct flights. So a lot of folks in my world seem to take that as corroboration that there was some sort of threat being communicated, but it's still, I made a joke about millennial terrorists only fly directs. They're totally going to change their plans now that they have to, connect through, Frankfurt or something. But this is kind of the state of play as we have it now. These are the major things that we've seen heretofore. So we have a variety of things kind of under consideration, and we can talk about these in detail in Q&A. So there was a White House released a budget that had 30% cuts to the State Department budget and to USAID's budget. There are days I could be talked into that, frankly, but that will have implications for the counterterrorism efforts, both in terms of the countering violent extremism, but also the other engagements that we do with partners and allies, as I said, not just in the Middle East and North Africa, but also with European partners. It's also, to the extent that the White House budget is always a signaling device, right? Because of course it has to be passed by Congress, and it's only what Congress authorizes and appropriates that actually matters. It speaks to the White House's vision of how they would like to go forward with a variety of national security questions. There's been a lot of discussion of designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Muslim Brotherhood is a Islamist political group, renounced violence many years ago, but is certainly seen as very threatening in a variety of places. The Egyptian government in particular is quite hostile to the Brotherhood, where the Brotherhood is a totally clandestine, internecine sort of organization, seen to be infiltrating all kinds of things, because it is. In Jordan, the Muslim Brotherhood is a public political party with seats in parliament, right? So there was literally a report yesterday, that appears to be on the back burner for now due to pushback from the State Department. So, somebody wrote a memo and somebody actually read it and listened to it, and that seems to be on hold for the moment. There's been maybe a request for troops from Afghanistan. General Nicholson, or as I call him, General Nicholson Army, because I used to work for General Nicholson Marine Corps, and they don't like each other, so it's important to make that distinction and not send emails from one to the other, especially about the other, because that happened once. But he testified in Congress in January and said that he was planning to request troops. We don't think that an actual formal troop request has come up just yet. But as part of that, there might also be a request to shift from the current advising mission, which basically prevents our troops from engaging in offensive actions on their own, to a switch back to a combat footing, which would allow them to do independent operations and to engage directly. There's been a lot of talk in kind of very wonky circles about these different authorities with regard to airstrikes and drone strikes, especially in this discussion of civilian casualties. You guys might have seen reports from Mosul this week of at least 100 and potentially up to 200 civilians killed at an airstrike on a building in Mosul. There had been a strike on a mosque in Syria a week before. Again, it's hard to tell if this is the result of already loosened rules of engagement or part of the challenge of operating in urban areas and things that could have occurred in a variety of other circumstances. So the main thing under review right now that is almost certainly going to be approved is this discussion of devolving authorities to ground commanders from the White House in designated, quote, war zones. So right now, airstrikes require White House approval, and for those of you who have worked in the defense space, that drives the Defense Department crazy. For some good reasons, it means they have trouble actioning dynamic targets. It also means they can't just do what they want, which in general they find objectionable. So the Trump administration seems willing to cede that to the Defense Department. That gives me just a tiny bit of pause, and there's a couple reasons. But one of which is after the Yemen raid, the White House also then blamed the casualties on the Defense Department. And so I think the Pentagon should be a little bit more wary of getting control over things when it seems like there's a bus with pretty bright lights that might just come rolling over them when things go south. There's also discussion of designated some new war zones to basically get this battlefield authority in additional places. Right now it only applies to Iraq and Syria. But the commander of AFRICOM has asked for it for Somalia. I think he's also asked for it for Libya, but I can't quite pin that down. And Yemen was at the top of that list until this previous raid. And so that's now either on the back burner or they're waiting for some other things to work out on Yemen policy. Finally, with regard to the airstrikes discussion is a broader consideration of whether they're going to change our rules of engagement outside those places. These would be places basically where the idea is that you'd be striking against an al-Qaeda target, but you're not in one of the designated countries. So maybe you're going after someone Boko Haram related in Nigeria, or a new cell pops up somewhere in the Gulf or somewhere in Niger or Mali. What would be the process for actioning a target under those circumstances? And so it looks like that it's not clear what's going to happen on the civilian casualty rules, but we currently have this standard, which is that the target themselves needs to be providing an imminent and continuing danger, which is kind of a weird thing. Like, is it imminent or isn't continuing, and how does that work exactly? that standard will probably be eliminated, so that the question will be focused more on civilian casualties and generally a threat to American national interest, but it doesn't have to have this imminent standard. We can come back to this if folks have specific questions, but this is kind of one laundry list of the things that we've been, in the open press, in the cocktail party circuit, such makes for a really boring cocktail party, I gotta tell you. But that is a pretty decent overview of the kinds of things that are being discussed. We'll note that I don't know what they're talking about with regard to threat finance. I mean, that just hasn't sort of pushed its way through, if anything's going to change one way or another on that, for example. More broadly, we of course know there's a Syria policy review underway, and it seems that there's some kind of small changes to Syria policy going on. Obviously, as we speak, we saw from the earlier slides. It seems right now, as best I can tell, the Syria policy review is done. I think Secretary Mattis, I can't call him General Mattis anymore, Secretary Mattis has selected an option, but we don't expect that there's going to be a public rollout of that. Because our preferred option is to work with the Syrian Kurds, which infuriates our NATO allies, the Turks. And so we're just going to go ahead and do it. We're not going to have a big parade about it, is what seems to be happening, and what a couple of people have confirmed, to me. So that starts basically, as we're seeing right now, as a campaign for Raqqa, which is over here, which is the sort of Syrian capital of the Islamic State, and we're have troops up in Manbij and pushing sort of south. There was some sort of air assault on the airfield outside Takba. There's a big dam there as well, which American troops participated in, but weren't at the front line. And anybody who was like, I don't really know how you do air assaults that aren't considered close to the front line, but that is one piece of it. We are going to rely on Syrian Kurds for much of that activity. And then tried to basically diplomatically manage the fallout with the Turks. Secretary Tillerson made a comment at a big meeting last week of the counter-ISIL coalition that said that there would be interim safe areas. Nobody knows what that means exactly. That is not current policy. I happen to think that's a terrible idea, but is, again, sort of in the words matter portion of diplomacy and policy announcements. People are trying to figure out exactly what we're, if we're actually going to do that, and how would you, what's the Manning document looks like, who else in the coalition is participating.
Did you say why you think it's a bad idea?
I think they become killing fields. I mean, I think you mass a bunch of unarmed civilians in a place that you haven't properly secured. I think the regime would bomb the daylights out of it. And the only way to stop that is to shoot down regime planes, and some of those might be Russian planes, and now we're really off to the races. So, but some people disagree with that, obviously. There's also been discussion in terms of the eventual political settlement about some form of confederation. If you guys, it's a little bit hard to see the colors, but this kind of yellow slot up to the north, that's all Syrian Kurds. The green down here is regime left. The white is really a giant desert. And then the pink is the Syrian rebels, opposition. It's pretty hard to see how the regime reconquers the rest of Syria at some level, or gets a political integration out of that. But there's a lot of opposition to another autonomous Kurdish region. So again, the political dynamics of that, I don't think we have a formal policy on that, certainly one way or the other. This map and the one that comes next are from the Institute for Study of War. They put together really good Syria and Iraq maps. I don't always agree with their policy recommendations, but they collect some really good data. So yeah, I mean, that's the, broadly speaking, the Syria policies seem to be, kind of a pumped up version of what the Obama administration had already teed up in terms of the plans for Raqqa and the wait and see on the political agenda for the next steps. Maybe a little bit faster timeline, maybe a few more troops, but we haven't seen major changes from what had already been teed up. In Iraq, I don't know why that's not in color. I'm sorry. whatever. There's some parts of Iraq that ISIS holds, and there's some parts that they don't. That's the main. It's just a device for me to talk about Iraq from. Sorry. Iraq is a little bit different, right? So the discussion in Syria is mostly about ISIS in Syria, and then you have this two diplomatic challenges of the Turks and then the Russians, right? And so that's really what drives the ISIS discussion. The Iraq discussion is largely driven by Iran and people's perception of the Iranian threat and where Iraq falls in that orbit. So if you wanted to kind of look at the different camps, and I think this is all still quite undecided. We're pursuing obviously a campaign to take back Mosul. It's not super clear what happens to Mosul after the military piece is done. But the rest of Iraq policy still seems pretty up in the air, and there's probably three factions you could look at. So one are some hardcore folks who are mostly around the National Security Council at the moment, who think that Iraq is basically months away from permanently slipping into the Iranian orbit, and we need to invest significantly to prevent that from happening. There's a more, you might call it mainstream group, which is comprised of folks like Secretary Mattis and Brett McGurk, who's a former ambassador to Iraq and runs the counter-ISIL office at the State Department, who would instead focus more on kind of Sunni reconciliation, resolving the Kurdish-Arab disputes in the north, again, working a kind of longer-term diplomatic process, probably keep the troop levels about where they are, but not radically draw up or down, but instead push the politics piece next. And then you have a camp that are definitely America Firsters, which are basically like, once we get this Mosul piece done, everybody out. We'll leave it to them to sort out. It's pretty unclear how that's going to shake out. H.R. McMaster, the new National Security Advisor, is probably somewhere in between the first two camps. I don't know, there's not a lot of national security folks in that third America First camp, but there's clearly influential people like Steve Bannon in the White House who would push an option like that, so we really don't know who the president will listen to.
You've seen several times during the campaign, and I think a couple times since, Trump say oil.
Yep.
Is that in any camp, or is that just kind of ignoring that?
I mostly ignore that. There's not really a way to actually,
I know.
I can't, you'd have to imagine him directing like U.S. military forces to go and seize oil fields, and I've stopped saying that could never happen because I've been wrong several times on those claims, but that is not being discussed by anyone that I'm aware of. Sir?
Have you seen any tie-up between the Kurdish forces in Iraq and the Kurdish forces in Syria?
It happens occasionally. Like, one challenge the Kurds have is that not only does nobody like them, but they don't like each other, as best I could tell. So there's not a great deal of love between the Syrian Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds. I think there was some movement back and forth, especially when the Iraqi government forces had collapsed so heavily in the north, and ISIS was really running the whole sort of border. You saw folks moving back and forth, but Syrian Kurds certainly have no need for Iraqi Kurds to show up on their side of the border in Syria. But this is the part of the ongoing challenge of Greater Kurdistan, right, which is 100-some years in the making. Yeah, go ahead.
About the configuration of Russian forces in Syria since the election. Any change in that?
I don't think we've seen a huge... we've sent some additional troops. We probably will send in total about 1,000 more troops than we had there in December, for example. I have not tried, I don't know, but I also haven't looked to see if, the Saudis, again, have promised anything and everything, but never actually deliver. The Jordanians have a handful of troops down here in Daraa, like down along their border here in the south, but they have no interest in getting into the meat grinder up north. So I haven't, I don't know that there's any additional European troop contributions at the moment. I certainly am not aware that we've asked for any. I don't think the Germans will be ponying up any anytime soon, unfortunately. So we can, but I don't have exact details on that. I saw another hand up here. Yeah.
Could you repeat the middle stance that's out there regarding Iraq?
Oh, so that's more of a focus on political reconciliation at the national level in Iraq, so focusing on getting the government, which is led by a Shia prime minister at the moment, to be less sectarian, get Sunnis and Anbar in particular, but also in the north, to feel more buy-in into the Baghdad government, and then to address the issues in Erbil and elsewhere on the Kurdish and Arab territorial disputes.
Essentially, a continuation.
Yeah.
Of the last one.
Yeah. I mean, with probably the same plussed up troop numbers that we have here. So, in terms of, this is what I'm called, what wonks are wondering, right? So, we spend just so much time on these sorts of things. Will the Trump administration pursue a new or amended AUMF, and that's an authorization for use of military force? That's currently the legal construct by which we are deploying troops. It's what Congress has agreed to. There are a handful of folks in Congress who would like to have a new AUMF debate, specifically with regard to Syria. I don't think John McCain has any interest in that. And usually if John McCain's not interested in a defense discussion, it doesn't tend to happen. But it is, if you were going to have a revised strategy, you would maybe at some point want revised domestic legal authorization, right, for where you can pursue strikes and against whom and in what manner. But I would like to have that debate because I would think that could be productive, but it does not seem, that seems unlikely. But we're all still kind of wondering if we're going to get a new AUMF. Are signature strikes back on the table? So in the early Obama administration, there were drone strikes in particular authorized against individuals, even if we didn't have specific names, but they had a pattern of activity that appeared to be linked to terrorist activity or terrorist groups. Those were called signature strikes. It's sort of a pattern analysis style of attacks. In the 2013 speech at National Defense University, we announced we were no longer doing that. We introduced this more specific approval process for drone strikes and airstrikes that required that's continuing imminent threat status, these other sorts of things. Unclear if we'll go back to, if we're shelving the Obama guidelines, does that mean that signature strikes are back on the table? I haven't heard a huge push for people who want that back, but, I'm sure there'd be people who'd be happy to have the authorities. Will Iran distract from the Al-Qaeda ISIS fight? So in general, the folks, as I said before, who are most invested and most knowledgeable on Iraq policy and the political dynamics in Iraq are not folks who are super invested in the counter-ISIL campaign. They tend to be motivated and knowledgeable about Iranian political machinations and Iranian involvement in Iraq. So you can see this. There was a report, I think just yesterday, that Secretary Mattis has requested more troops to go to Yemen, which, as we know, is a place where there's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There's a counterterrorism threat there. Except he wants those troops to support the counter-Houthi activities, right, which is what the Saudis are most interested in, which is an Iranian-backed militia that has displaced the Yemeni government and has almost no territorial overlap with AQAP, right? So that's interesting. Right, that I think leads to the next question. What are we doing in Yemen? Which was not a question that I thought I would be asking at this point in the administration. There's a couple different, parlor games going around, where will our first, war be? Yemen would have been a good dark horse candidate, but I think it's come up in the ratings recently. But it's certainly something that Secretary Mattis would have focused on when he was the commander of Central Command several years ago. Yemen's been a weird burr in the side for folks, both on the counterterrorism front, but also on this creeping Iranian influence and proxy wars that they're particularly good at. And so the Houthis have been pretty active, and it's not that they've been so successful, but the Yemeni government's been borderline useless. So, which has been true since the civil war in Yemen. It's not a new problem. So that's a good. What are we doing in Yemen is a great question. What's the reconstruction planning for Syria look like? Some folks feel like that they've been to this movie before, and they want to know, have we learned anything from our activities in Iraq and also Afghanistan? Are we doing serious both political and development planning for, what? So you take Raqqa, now what? Frankly, you take Mosul, now what? I don't have a good answer for that. I'm sure there are parts of the State Department who are doing that planning, just like they did the last time. So we'll see if that starts to get incorporated into the broader strategic dialogue as well. Is there more of an interest in a counterinsurgency style approach for Iraq or Syria? And that would mean, again, more ground forces, more whole of government, more kind of larger scale involvement on the ground than we've had so far. There are a couple of advocates of that on the NSC, but again, doesn't seem to be much of a broader political appetite, but it is kind of part of the conversation. And finally, my question, and this is because I'm not really a counterterrorism person, are we just mowing the grass, right? We're turning ourselves into knots over these rules of engagement for drone strikes and airstrikes. What's the strategic effect of that? Have we actually defeated or degraded Al-Qaeda or ISIS or AQAP, or fill in your acronym here, or is this the forever war? This is just what we will be doing for the rest of our natural born lives. So on that happy note, I'll turn it over to you guys for questions.
So we'll open it up, but I want to take the prerogative.
Mm-hmm.
So first, a criticism: you took all of our questions.
Sorry. Well, we can try to answer them, but
but I want you to say more about that last one, because that was my leading question. You started your talk by saying, I've got elements of a CT strategy, and maybe that's not the right word. The strategy implies a political objective. Mm-hmm. There's some point in which, if you have a coherent strategy, it's over. You've achieved it or not. Right? Whereas mowing the grass is more akin to policing. Mm-hmm. You don't stop policing. You keep on policing.
Exactly.
The Trump administration, at least in the first 60 some days, seems to be pulling in two directions on this. On the one hand, on odd numbered days, the president seems to be saying, we got to do more, faster, take the gloves off, bomb the bleep out of them, and so forth. On even numbered days, there's the America First element of it, which is we should get out of these war-torn places. We should come home. We should focus on making America great again. Where do you think the administration is going? Is it leaning more towards the grass mowing exercise? This is permanent, sort of quasi-imperial policing, or is this just temporary until we do Mosul, Raqqa, and then come home?
So I don't think that there's any appetite beyond a couple of problem children on the NSC on this sort of thing. Right. And I think we'll see that, because I don't think that we're going to get very much on reconstruction planning. We're going to let the Europeans do it. We're going to tell the UN to do it. We're going to, I think it's hard to imagine a full-throated effort on that the way that we saw eventually in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I have plenty of criticisms of the efforts of that in Afghanistan, to be sure. Where I think they we talked about this on the podcast the last episode, which is called Iraq Chalk Chicken Hawk, which is obviously the greatest name for a podcast episode of all time. Rada worked in the office for the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, and she's a avowed advocate of this direct action sort of campaign. Of high-value targeting and doing it for a long time. I don't know. The most successful targeted killing campaign that I'm aware of is Israeli efforts in the West Bank in 2002 to 2005, which had a operational impact for a certain amount of time, but it's hard to say that had a strategic impact in terms of Israeli security or resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Where I think the Trump administration is likely to split the difference, and this is both how you please both camps, but also trying to find the coherence, because I think he means both of these things. He does want to bomb the daylights out of things, but he's not going to put any ground troops in, right? The Yemen piece is where this is now weird, because that I can't square with the broader kind of militarism or aggressiveness, because it's just a weird set of permissions and threat perceptions. I think that's being driven by Jim Mattis. But I think that there'll be, I guess the other place where this becomes a challenge is, this is why it's interesting that the White House is willing to agree to pushing these authorities down. We may just have all of foreign policy run out of Tampa, within a few months, which was already well on its way down that track. And that's, I think, part of why there was such, bristling, but also both perceived and actual micromanagement by the White House, is because you could totally run foreign policy from Tampa. For folks who don't know, that's where both Central Command and Special Operations Command are. A lot of folks, a lot of assets, you can do a lot from down there. Huge span of control. Maybe they're just going to cede it all to the Defense Department, and then we're going to be back to just the military and intelligence stuff, because they don't have the resources or the authorities to do the other pieces. So that could be interesting. Sir?
Since I came of age during the Vietnam War era, as did Donald Trump also, I'm curious if anyone inside the military, the State Department, or anywhere in the administration is talking about lessons from Vietnam. And I'm thinking in particular, is there any counterpart to a domino theory working here in the Middle East? If we don't do something, Saudi Arabia might go down.
General McMaster wrote a very good book on lessons from Vietnam, which is much more about civilian control and the problems that general officers might face in the, you can all go read Dereliction of Duty. I haven't heard much discussion of domino theory per se, but there's certainly, the Saudis have this fear of kind of an Iranian domino effect, right? And so you see, Iranians are quite good at developing and cultivating proxies, or partner, governments. So you see that in Assad, you see that in Hezbollah, you see that with the Houthis, and so they are certainly and in Iraq now. So they are certainly concerned about that. It's hard to see. The idea of the domino theory of countries falling to communism, I don't know that countries fall to Islamism in quite the same way. And for the Saudis to be concerned about that would be kind of the height of concern trolling, in my opinion. But of course, it's a literal theocracy in Saudi Arabia as well. But I haven't heard that in particular. But it is interesting. Most of the debate, just from a narrative perspective, is couched in terms of the Iraq lessons, and we don't hear as much on the Vietnam side. But we do have. But you're right to note that Trump is of that generation in a way that Obama wasn't. Right, he was too young. Sir, in the back in the black.
So my question is about the strategy or the lack of strategy behind the way we have conducted the war on terror. So it's not like it has been a great success so far, but when we look at the wonks debate, and when we look at potential solutions, the initiatives that the Trump administration is thinking about, cutting the budgets of USAID, State Department, declaring the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist movement, which would be, I think, incredibly self-defeating. More troops for Afghanistan is very militarized, and there's not much about the sources of the problem. I was wondering, to what extent do you think that the development of a major national security complex in Washington since 9/11 has been a problem in terms of preventing alternative solutions from emerging in a strategic debate? Because we have so many institutions, so many think tanks, etc., which are involved in the development, of military solutions, that this may create an inertia in terms of strategy, and as a result, we don't see any alternative to what we have done for the last 15 years.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I guess I would also note that there is an aid industrial complex, and you don't hear about it quite as much, but the implementing partners for USAID are, $100 million companies, many of them. You mostly hear about them when there are corruption scandals, of which there are more than a few. But it is, of course, the case that the Defense Department, just dwarfs really every other agency in terms of budget and personnel, and has been the preferred arm of activity. And also, I would say, not exclusively, but if you're an up-and-comer in national security, the Defense Department is for the most part a more dynamic place to work than state civil service or USAID, unless you're out in the field with aid. So it's attracted a lot of talent, and that then gives you a certain orientation to the problem. The question then is, I think that the counterterrorism strategy is also tied up with U.S. internationalism more broadly, right? And so a restraint policy on counterterrorism also looks like a restraint policy in a lot of other venues, right? In a lot of other regions around the world. So Hal Brands and Peter Feaver had a good article in Foreign Affairs a month or so ago, kind of laying out 4 counterterrorism strategy options. And unsurprisingly, they try to Goldilocks the set of solutions, but they actually know that they're all pretty bad, right? The bring everybody home is bad, the invade everywhere plan is bad, and the middle two sort of split the difference on the badness, depending on which way you go. The challenge of understanding analytically how terrorist groups emerge and under what conditions, and why people join them. And those are actually 2 quite distinct. I have a lot of opinions on one and no good information on the other. Are really important. But how that then gets translated into policy that we can do as a foreign government, right, I think is in another degree removed. And that's in some ways that's almost a more tractable problem in Europe. Looking at what the UK or the French or the Dutch are doing with their domestic populations and working on counter-radicalization and trying to prevent extremist messaging and a lot of the kind of hopelessness that seems to drive the membership. I think is in some ways more tractable than trying to solve Egypt, right, or trying to solve Saudi challenges. But I agree that it's under-resourced, but I'm also not sure if you doubled the State Department's budget instead of cutting it by 30%, what would they do differently, right? They are also part of how they think the world works and how U.S. policy is created, right? Sir?
Regarding Russia's involvement in Syria, which is implicitly involved with terrorism, for a possible long-range view, let's say the next couple of years, what do you think their actions and activity and views will be, and will those have any effect on Trump as far as our involvement in Syria?
Yeah, this is, I think, going to be fascinating because so Trump obviously has at least rhetorically, if not in policy as of yet, been rather fond of Putin personally, and hasn't had much bad to say about Russian actions in either Syria or Ukraine, for example. But the Russians are allied with Iran in Syria, right? Because they're all on the side of the regime. And there's a significant anti-Iran contingent in his cabinet and in his national security staff. So I'm not sure he knows that, first of all, I have to say. And I don't know that I don't think he's losing sleep over the details just yet. The question is whether he had an expectation of trying to get some grand bargain with Putin, we won't call it a reset, but to reorient U.S.-Russian relations. I think there was an expectation on the Russian side that certainly sanctions relief of some sort was coming at some point in the first year of the administration. But what were we going to get out of that? I think everybody is still trying to figure out what would be the terms of the bargain, right? You can imagine a number of concessions that you could make to the Russians because we've done a lot to them. But it remains, I don't think that they have a great strategic footing in Syria. Their client state is, a rump state. They want it for sort of prestige reasons and for base access reasons in terms of getting into the Mediterranean. But they're not dealing a strong hand. That said, they're a total spoiler, right? And I don't, it's hard enough to, the Syria constellation is really difficult, and that's why it's such a quagmire, right? There's not an obvious political solution that appeases both the internal and the external actors. So I wish I had a better answer on Syria, but I haven't had a good one in 4 years. Ma'am, hang on just a second. Ma'am.
All I hear is talking about terrorism and trying to stop it. But what we've done, I think, the last years to Iraq, Afghanistan, what we haven't done maybe for Syria, we probably have lost a generation, maybe 2 generations of people that had been under war the whole time. Haven't had schooling, lack of food, everything else. Do you think in, say, a generation from now, we're going to have more ISIS-type groups? Because these people are going to be, why didn't you help us? Why did you come into Iraq?
Yeah, I mean, you see that long-term effect more in Afghanistan than anywhere else, which of course has been essentially under some form of active conflict for literally my entire life. This gets back to this fundamental question of why do you think how do terrorist groups emerge and why do people join them? And certainly, if that's a politically tractable narrative more broadly in the society, then there can be groups that can grab onto that and channel that into violence against Americans or Shias or Sunnis or others. I think certainly on the Syria side, there was a more powerful argument for that a few years ago in terms of a much more relaxed refugee policy by the U.S. and the Europeans, and maybe some sort of step up, if at all possible, on the humanitarian assistance side. The flip side, unfortunately, is, at least on Syria, is also true. If we had deployed 30,000 troops, you could ask the same questions, whether we would see more terrorists,
Do you personally think maybe that'll happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of room for a variety of extremist ideologies to take place. I think it's easy. In both the American left and the American right tend to focus on the critical importance of American actions, right? We're either the solution to everything or the cause of problems for everything. I think that these are also Baghdad issues. These are also Damascus issues. But this is part of whether are we going to be mowing the grass, right? And will those extremist groups be focused on flying airplanes into tall buildings, or are they going to try to overthrow their own local governments, right? You can do both, but the evolution of Al-Qaeda is pretty interesting in this regard. They actually started on the overthrow local governments piece, and they all got thrown in jail in Egypt. And so they were like, what we'll do? Far enemy. Well, let's try that for a while. I would say we mentioned earlier, I think we have actually had, if it's not necessarily strategic success, significant successes against Al-Qaeda, who's not been able to launch a large operation in a Western country since the Madrid bombings, since the London bombings. It's been 14 years. I could have to check the exact list, but it's been quite some time. They are nowhere near as operationally effective as they were in the early 2000s. That says something. Now, at what price, right? And that's an important question, and that's that balancing question. That's what a strategy really should be doing always, is balancing what risks you're accepting on one side or another. What didn't we do while we were focusing on Al-Qaeda? What else did we then generate because we focused on Al-Qaeda in a certain way? But that's I think ISIS is back on its heels for the most part. But that's an easy thing to say from a boardroom in Dallas, Texas, right? The view looks different certainly in the Middle East and in Western Europe. Other hands over here. Yep.
Several of the theaters you mentioned had groups in there that were sponsored or affiliated with Iran, and Trump was very anti-Iran campaign. Have you seen the strategy toward Iran change at all?
Not yet,
Discussion there?
but it will.
It will?
Yeah. These people are not the Obama people on the Iran deal. Whether the Iran deal gets scrapped is an interesting question. A friend of ours, and this is on the podcast, we're talking about this a little bit this week, that the Obamacare discussion actually plays out on the Iran deal discussion, you might be able to find some votes to repeal the Iran deal, but no one agrees with enough about what should replace it. Right? There's the coalition of interests, both domestically and amongst international partners. I mean, there's a reason it took like 3 years to negotiate it, right? I mean, it's very carefully, and it's far from a perfect deal, just like most compromise policies are far from perfect. I don't think Secretary Mattis wants to scrap the deal, but I think he's very suspicious of Iran's compliance with it. It's actually probably pretty healthy to be suspicious. You shouldn't be overly trusting of the Iranian regime. But there's definitely folks who are much more comfortable with military confrontation and other activity with Iran than you would have seen previously. Whether that gets announced in strategy, whether that, there's a sort of almost suicide by cop approach, where they let we've been, strafed in the Gulf and now, game on. I don't know that we should expect a Gulf of Tonkin situation, but there's folks who would love an opportunity to revise the Iran strategy, and we'll see. The question is who pushes back on that. So one of the things that I worry about in terms of civil-military relations and the planning process is that the Defense Department, not always, but certainly has a habit of sort of having Goldilocks. They send up a set of options, and it's, here's your 10,000 troop option, and here's your 100,000 troop option, and I wonder which option the building wants. Oh, look, it's the one in the middle, right? And so they want the Goldilocks, middle strategy. I think there's folks in the White House that'll pick too hot, like every time, and then they're gonna have to go action and man this plan that they didn't actually intend of having to put forward. It's a bit of a caricature, but I've run that by folks who say that that's something they've heard discussed on the Joint Staff about how you actually put those packages together. I worry about that with Iran for sure.
On this issue of the Iran deal, there's been some speculation that rather than trying to just flat out scrap the Iran deal, to keep poking Iran until Iran scraps the Iran deal, right? Mm-hmm. And this is Mike Flynn saying you're on notice. Yep. There's all sorts of ways in which the Trump administration could needle
for sure
Iran. Do you think that that's a likely trajectory? Because in that sense,
certainly plausible.
Sanctions sort of snap back, right?
Who could say?
Without having to design your own replacement.
That's right. Yeah, no, I mean, that would not surprise me. I think it would be unsettling, but it would not be surprising. Sir?
All the discussion and various things we've talked about here are very short term. What is the planning to address this as the long war? I was over there 5 times, this guy at least that many or more. The longer you go over there, the more you realize it is a long war. Someone was talking about domino theory. There is a scriptural basis. It's written down for what is going on. It animates, motivates people. You can say it's distortions of that message. No need to get in that, but there is something that continues to animate people to engage in this 1,400 years on. So do we look at this as a long war to blunt that somehow? I'm not sure we can. I don't really think we can. It's got to be internal. But do we still look at this somehow from a long war perspective?
Not very often. So I remember when we talked about this as the long war, and then there was pushback even in the Bush administration because they didn't. How do you tell the long war? I mean, that doesn't sound good. The Obama administration, of course, wanted nothing to do with that language. That was, and then GWAT, of course, went out with it. What I hear more amongst folks, kind of, in my crew, and there's a group of us that kind of think of ourselves in the, not Gen X or Boomer, but 9/11 generation. Were you of an age where 9/11 just fundamentally changed your life? I started graduate school the day after 9/11. I had just moved to Boston. It's all I've done. In one way or another. I have folks who, they were in SAMS, the military planning school, that year, and they'd missed every previous deployment, but now it was game on, right? So there's, in the analytic community and in certain parts of the professional community, there is an appreciation for what a long-term engagement this is. Our government, both the professional staff and certainly the political staff, are so poorly suited to that. And we don't think about it that way. We don't resource it that way. We resource, and we resource, programs of record, for big equipment, not long-term strategy pieces. It's interesting to try to. There were efforts, probably a decade ago, to try to compare the war on terror to containment, or to things, NSC 68. I mean, things that were big policy documents, reorganizations that came out, in the late 40s, as the sort of hot phase of the Cold War was really confronting people. We've seen a little bit of the institutional reorganization, although I would certainly go another round again, I think. The National Counterterrorism Center is usually regarded as a pretty big success. Director of National Intelligence, a little bit less so. DHS was not set up for success in a great many ways bureaucratically. But we haven't seen a shift in kind of the mindset, with the long-term one. And we don't have, our approach, if you think about the kind of comparison to the Cold War period where there was containment and then there were confrontation folks. We've been in confrontation mode for at least a good portion, of this. What would a containment strategy look like? Does ISIS show that a containment strategy is not feasible because there's enough, free flow of people that, small attacks, change things? You compare the attack in London last week to the London bombings in 2005. One of those does not look like the other, but it still drives coverage and fear in a very elemental way. And so I think we've probably lost a little bit of traction on that front, on the resilience space. I think the Europeans still do it a little bit better than us, but everything is now part of this world, grand conspiracy, and that's challenging. Sorry.
Can we change the dialogue?
Well, a big attack here would change the dialogue, and probably not in good ways, but it would change it.
No, get us off the fixation on terrorism.
That's a good question. I think that goes to this earlier question that it does drive, even people like me. I don't try to purport that most of these are existential threats, right? They're like intellectually interesting to me, but that doesn't mean they should suck up.
This is sort of all you've known.
Yeah.
Professional life. And have we known anything else, since the end of the Cold War? I don't know.
Yeah, peacekeeping sorts of stuff. So there certainly has been a shift in some parts of the dialogue with sort of revanchist Russia, right? Which, Walter Russell Mead had a piece a couple years ago, Return of Geopolitics, which I thought was pretty good from a sort of shifting the dialogue, perspective. North Korea has been pushing people, I spend a lot of time now reading on North Korea because I don't know anything about it. So that, and then, we've tried sort of a pivot to Asia, but basically didn't take, at least in terms of the dialogue piece. So there's, nation states are definitely back in a way that they were not dominating discussion in 2005 or 2009. You don't hear nearly as much discussion of ungoverned spaces. That does not seem to be, the challenge is not ungoverned, it's hostile governed space. Even in Syria, we don't worry about the ungoverned space. We worry about the places that ISIS has control, which should have been how we talked about Afghanistan all along. The problem wasn't that it was ungoverned. The problem was that it was governed by the Taliban, which is a different challenge.
So where does the dialogue on humanitarian intervention fit into this? That was real big around Kosovo. And
Nowhere.
But is that faded away?
Yep. 0%. Some mix of
it's one of the
right and left, but
it is one of the justifications for Yemen.
Yes.
The talk of a famine, the talk we must get in and do something.
And it certainly has driven certain parts of the conversation on, the folks in the Obama administration who were most frustrated with the Obama Syria policy were usually frustrated from a humanitarian perspective, which is totally reasonable. But there's no Kosovo solution to either of these two particular problems.
Just because there's no solution doesn't mean we won't get in.
Right.
Libya.
Right. Well, I mean, and so, yeah, that's the air power is a solution that never dies in Washington, I have to say. But yeah, there's that dynamic. I mean, a war in East Asia would change the dialogue. So we got that to look forward to.
But you've been struggling since the days of this long. Shoehorn this into some kind of geopolitical framework.
Yeah.
It strikes me that nobody is able to do that, basically.
I mean, the challenge is that it basically has the role to play a spoiler to a bunch of other items on the geopolitical agenda, right? So on the one hand, maybe you're not that motivated by the humanitarian crisis in Syria, but your European allies are being, struggling to deal with refugees, and now you're seeing that's certainly part of what's driving the rise of right-wing parties, there, who also don't like the EU and don't like NATO and have other criticisms of what had been shared elements of international policy, right?
Series of talks.
Yes. Well, so you can't ignore it from that perspective. Certainly, Iran is a regional player, if not a geostrategic player, and people have definitely made the argument that we basically allowed Syria to persist because we cared more about a nuclear deal with Iran than Syria. It's hard to, it seems so callous and heartless to say that was worth it. From a pure interest perspective, probably was worth it. We'll see if the deal holds. That's the real question, right? Russia's also playing, and so this is the, resolving their terrorism issue doesn't resolve your geopolitical issues, but you can't disentangle it, and that becomes sort of the...
It strikes me that the geopolitical stakes are much greater on the European side.
With regard to ISIS?
And
terrorism?
terrorism.
I think the place, and this is where I've tried to understand sort of a little bit of the psychology, of this. I've lived in Washington for about a decade, and I spent a year in Afghanistan, right? Like, I've moved around. I got mugged outside my apartment. Usually a car window broken. Usual Washington stuff. Parents never said anything. I probably never told them, but I was living in Washington. It was fun. My little brother moved to Washington to start law school a couple years ago, and the day after the Paris nightclub attacks, my dad calls. I need you and your brother to make a plan. Plan? Plan for what? Christmas? Like, what are we talking about? He's like, shit goes down. What are you guys gonna do? I'm like, I'm gonna watch Netflix and stay at home. Like, what do you mean? What am I gonna do? But he, my dad lives in Kansas City. Is a 65-year-old, college graduate, professional, terrified for his children now, living in Washington. He's not worried about North Korean ICBMs. He also, interestingly, is not worried about crazy people with AR-15 shooting up the shopping malls that I go to all the time, right? But this particular threat has him totally exorcised, and there's something about that in terms of American domestic politics of protecting the homeland. That's part of why 9/11 was just such an utter shock. It's interesting still now to hear Bush administration officials talk about it.
Have you been over to the library?
I have not been to the library, but that's part of what drives it, right? And so the security world, we could talk about China and Iran and North Korea, but the domestic public and the congressional representatives who represent them are really motivated on this particular topic. So what do you do?
I think people are more worried about that, like you mentioned your dad so vividly, because there's 100 TV shows that show them exactly what it would look like, so they can picture it, and they can't picture what a ICBM really looks like anymore.
Yeah, there's just probably a bunch of interesting, I'm a political scientist, not a psychologist, right? Reasons why that's the case. There's good research on, why we focus on small threats of food poisoning and not the tens of thousands of people who die in car accidents every day. right? We humans are sort of, at least modern American humans seem to be bad at a particular kind of risk assessment. And I think
The DHS meeting in Washington a couple of days ago. I think it's the equivalent of 3 747s crashing.
Mm-hmm.
What the people died in car accidents.
Yeah. It's, but you never hear about it. I mean, you're in control when that, nobody does that to you, or maybe somebody does, but I don't know, like it's, ma'am.
So I'm curious, what does the planning for reconstruction in Syria look like? When I saw that question, my thought was, well, we don't get to have a say in that, even if we wanted to, because Assad will decide what reconstruction.
If he's still there, that's true.
So I guess that was my question, which made me think, where is the current thinking in D.C. or in European capitals on working with Assad, or what's an ideal solution?
Yeah.
He disappears like the witch in the Wizard of
Yep.
Oz. You dump water.
We
on
take
it,
that.
and it goes.
That sounds great. Melting. Yeah, I mean, there was a small movement for, you heard talk about that kind of at the end of the Obama administration. Well, maybe now we'll get this, and maybe Trump was going to be amenable to that because he was close to the Russians, or seemed to be fond of them, at least anyway. His cabinet picks, to my mind, totally preclude that, right? Like, I just can't imagine Mattis or McMaster going along with an Assad deal because of the way it would empower the Iranians, which, right, is part of it. But we do, not like we've never done that before, right? So I think that for a long time, the implied position seemed to be that the regime stays in power, but he himself has to leave. The problem with that, and you have to know way more about the internecine ways that the Assad family has managed the security services, and kind of the way the economic ties actually have stemmed out from the regime. Only Assad can do it. There's nobody else that could actually hold all of those pieces together. So he's unlikely to accept that. Certainly his security services wouldn't accept that. Sir?
What do you see Erdogan doing in the future? I know.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were on this point, but hang on one second.
I'm sorry.
So I mean, this has been the problem. I mean, it's a problem with our strategic thinking in general. It's been a particular problem with Syria. We don't have a good answer. We don't know what the political solution looks like. I think this, confederation idea is always just a way of being well, maybe in 10 years we'll talk about partition, but we don't want to talk about it now, which is essentially what the Iraq political solution, has been. There's a lot less oil money in Syria, so there's less to fight over, but all the oil in Syria is out in Deir ez-Zor, which is ISIS territory. So, I don't know. Now, sir.
What do you see going forward, Erdogan? Certainly slippery and not to be trusted. I think he took $3 billion from the Europeans to stop the refugees, and now he said that deal is off.
Right.
His son's in oil smuggling on the side.
I'm sure.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Where do you see him going?
Yeah, Turkey. One, I think you could argue that we have not managed that relationship well for probably 15 years, maybe longer. If they weren't a NATO ally, I think they would just be out on their ear. I mean, but it turns out they are. So now what, right? They were, as best I could tell, completely unhelpful in the early years of this war. One, obviously calling for complete regime change and being totally permissive at their border. So there were all kinds of folks coming in and out of Syria across the Turkish border. What do they want now? I mean, now they've got a real problem on their hands because they have a very capable Kurdish force sitting on their border. Now, those are Syrian Kurds, not Turkish Kurds, not technically PKK, but my understanding is that those two branches are closer than the Iraqi Kurds in that mix. So I don't think that Erdogan has a particularly strong hand to play. You've even watched the Russians and the Syrian Kurds come up along next to each other to counterbalance Turkey in certain parts along the border, which is just crazy to think about, but makes total sense in the weird Syrian landscape. So, I mean, I am not a Turkish expert. There's a lot of domestic politics that are driving Turkey, and I suspect, the thing that people like me like to do is to try to, it's always all geopolitics, right? We're all neoclassical realists at heart or something, but it's domestic politics that affect most people's policy choices most of the time. And so what happens to Erdogan is going to be a function of what happens domestically in Turkey, and where his base and security services. Is there a big PKK attack? Is there a false flag PKK attack? Will ISIS do more bombings in Turkey? I mean, those are all questions I think are on the table. So
there are a great many questions on the table, and there's a great many questions that I'm sure we still all have. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our discussion, so please join me in thanking Erin Simpson for